My mother called me from the bank, sobbing. They're accusing me of fraud and won't let me leave. When I stepped through those doors, the branch manager's expression drained and he said quietly, "Federal investigator. I didn't know she was your mother." My mother had never called me crying before, not when my father died, not when she was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes in 2019, not when her car was totaled in a parking lot the Christmas before last. Adele Farrell was 69 years old, a retired school librarian from Greenville, South Carolina, a woman who returned shopping carts to the corral in rainstorms and still handwrote thank you notes on paper she ordered from a stationery shop in Vermont. She didn't cry on phone calls. She definitely didn't call me in the middle of a Thursday afternoon from inside a bank to tell me someone was accusing her of fraud. So when her name appeared on my phone at 2:11 p.m. and I heard the first 3 seconds of her voice, the tightness in her breath, and the distinct quality of someone trying not to fall apart in public, I was already standing up from my desk before she finished the first sentence. "Dominic," she said, "they're saying I did something wrong. They won't let me leave. I don't understand what's happening. I am Dominic Farrell. I am 38 years old, and I have worked as a special agent with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit out of the Charlotte field office for 11 years. Before that, I spent 3 years as a bank examiner with the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. And before that, I got a master's degree in forensic accounting from George Washington University. I tell you this not to impress you, but because it matters enormously to what happened next and to how I understood, in about 6 seconds flat, exactly what kind of situation my mother was in. I had spent 11 years investigating financial fraud. I had built cases against mortgage schemers, wire fraud rings, embezzlers, and the particular breed of predator I found most repugnant. People who targeted elderly bank customers and systematically stole from them while smiling across a desk and asking if they wanted a complimentary coffee. I knew what that looked like from the inside of a case file. I was about to learn what it looked like from the other side of the counter, and it was worse than anything I had read in any report. Adele had driven herself to the Cornerstone Federal Bank branch on Pelham Road in Greenville at approximately 1:30 p.m. that Thursday. She went in to ask about a discrepancy she had noticed in her savings account statement. My mother was meticulous about her finances, the kind of person who reconciled her checkbook by hand every month and kept paper statements going back a decade in labeled accordion folders in her hall closet. She had noticed that her savings balance was $14,200 lower than she expected it to be, based on her own records. She had not made any large withdrawals. She had not authorized any transfers. The money was simply gone, replaced by a transaction description she didn't recognize. ACH transfer, reference code CF-TRUST-0092, dated 6 weeks prior. She brought her paper records with her. She sat down across from the branch manager, a man named Craig Sutton, and she showed him the discrepancy calmly and politely, the way she would have shown a student the error in their arithmetic. According to my mother, Sutton looked at the papers, looked at his computer screen, and then looked at her with an expression she described as suddenly very still. Then he told her that the transfer she was describing matched a pattern of fraudulent activity the bank had flagged on her account, and that he was going to need to ask her some questions before she could leave. He had a woman from the fraud department join them, and within 20 minutes, my mother had gone from being a customer with a legitimate complaint to being treated like a suspect. They had taken her records. They had her sitting in a glass-walled office with the door closed, and nobody had read her any rights because they weren't police, and that was the part that made my stomach drop when she described it, because it meant they were doing something the law doesn't have clean edges around, and a man like Craig Sutton would know exactly where those edges were. I told my mother to stop answering questions, to tell them her son was an attorney, close enough to buy time, and that she should not sign anything or hand over anything else. Then I ended the call, picked up my jacket, and drove 45 minutes down I-85 to Greenville at a speed I would prefer not to document. My hands were steady on the wheel. The rest of me was not. I had a protocol for situations like this. I was trained to approach financial crime scenes with deliberate calm, with the forensic patience of someone who knows that rushing destroys evidence and that the case you build in the first hour determines everything that follows. I applied every bit of that training to the 45-minute drive and arrived at the Pelham Road Cornerstone Federal Branch at 3:24 p.m. in a state I would describe as controlled fury. I walked through the glass doors and identified myself to the first person I saw, a young teller named Brianne who had the deer-in-headlights expression of someone who already knew the afternoon had gone sideways. I asked where the branch manager was. She pointed to the glass office at the back. I could see my mother through the glass, sitting with her hands folded in her lap, her back straight, her expression composed in the way it gets when she is working very hard not to show what she feels. There was a man on one side of the desk and a woman I didn't recognize on the other. I walked across that floor, knocked once on the glass door, and opened it. The man at the desk was Craig Sutton. He was in his mid-40s, well-dressed in the particular way of someone who considers the branch the stage for a performance. Navy suit, silver tie bar, hair combed with the kind of care that telegraphs self-importance. He looked up at me with the expression of someone who was already composing the sentence about how I couldn't be in here. And then I showed him my credentials. FBI badge, photo ID, Special Agent Dominic Farrell, Financial Crimes Unit. I watched his face. I've watched a lot of faces in 11 years, and Craig Sutton's face did something I had not entirely anticipated. It didn't go defensive. It didn't go aggressive. When it went white, and then it went still, in the specific way that a guilty person's face goes still when the variable they did not account for walks through the door and reveals itself. He said, very quietly, almost to himself, "Federal investigator, I didn't know she was your mother." And that sentence, that particular phrasing, told me more than anything else that had happened that afternoon. Because an innocent man would have said something like, "What's going on?" or "Can I help you?" or "There seems to be a misunderstanding." A man who said I didn't know she was your mother was a man who was already doing damage assessment, already recalculating, already afraid. I told my mother she was free to go. Sutton started to object, and I looked at him with the expression I have spent 11 years developing for exactly this type of moment, and told him, very quietly, that my mother was not under arrest, that he had no legal authority to detain her, and that anything she had handed over in the past 90 minutes had been obtained under coercive circumstances without proper disclosure of her rights. I told her to take her papers and wait for me in the lobby. She stood up, picked up her accordion folder, and walked past me without a word. I stayed in that office for another 4 minutes. I did not threaten Sutton. I did not tell him what I was going to do. I asked him 2 questions, both very simple, both designed to get him talking before he lawyered up. He answered both. I thanked him and left. In the car, while my mother sat in the passenger seat with her hands folded the same way they'd been folded inside that glass office, I called my supervisor, Supervisory Special Agent Renata Obi, who had been running the Charlotte Financial Crimes Unit for 9 years and had the sharpest instincts for elder fraud of anyone I had worked with. She answered on the second ring. I might have something, I told her. Or I might have a personal conflict of interest. Probably both. She was quiet for half a second. Tell me everything, she said. Renata Obi was 52, Nigerian-American, a former bank regulator who had come to the FBI after a decade at the FDIC. She did not panic. She did not move slowly. And she understood financial fraud the way a surgeon understands anatomy, structurally, from the inside out. When I finished laying out what had happened, including the specific transaction code CF-TRUST-0092, she was already typing. That reference code format, she said, is not standard ACH nomenclature. CF Trust is a custom routing tag. I've seen variations of it before. She paused. Give me 24 hours. I told her I needed to recuse myself from the investigation given that my mother was the victim. She said she'd already assumed that, and that she'd be assigning Agent Kwame Asante to lead. Kwame was 34, 3 years in the Financial Crimes Unit, meticulous, patient, and one of the few agents I knew who genuinely loved the document review phase of a case the way other people loved a good film. He called me within the hour. I need everything your mother has, he told me. Every paper statement going back 3 years, every ATM receipt she kept, everything. My mother, God bless her, had all of it. Every accordion folder, every labeled envelope, a full 37 months of financial documentation organized by date and category. We drove to my mother's house, and Kwame spent 4 hours at her kitchen table photographing every page while she made tea and answered his questions with the precise, measured patience of a woman who had spent 30 years helping people find the information they were looking for. What Kwame found, and what he walked me through on the phone that evening while I sat in my car outside my mother's house, because I couldn't trust myself to keep the professional distance I needed if I was inside hearing it in front of her, was the outline of something much larger than a single missing $14,200. What the CF Trust reference code appeared on my mother's account 3 times over 18 months, each time for amounts between $8,000 and $16,000, totaling $38,400 taken from her savings. The transactions were structured to fall below the $10,000 threshold that triggers mandatory bank reporting, a technique called structuring, and a federal crime in its own right. The destination account was registered to a trust entity called Cornerfield Asset Partners, LLC, incorporated in Delaware 8 months before the first transfer. Kwame ran the incorporation records. The registered agent was a shell address in Wilmington. but the signatory on the LLC's operating agreement, obtained through a subpoena filed within 16 hours of Kwame opening the case, was Craig Sutton. My hands were very cold when Kwame told me that. I sat in the dark outside my mother's house, and I thought about all of it. The stolen money, the manufactured accusation, the way Sutton had flipped my mother from complainant to suspect the moment she noticed something wrong. And I made myself breathe slowly and deliberately because what I felt in that moment was not something I could afford to act on. The next morning, Renata and Kwame presented their preliminary findings to the Assistant United States Attorney assigned to financial crimes cases for the Western District of North Carolina, a woman named Priscilla Nwankwo, 9 years with the DOJ, who had prosecuted 3 elder fraud rings in the past 4 years, and had a conviction rate that people in the office discussed in the tone usually reserved for sports statistics. She reviewed Kwame's overnight report and the initial transaction analysis and asked 2 questions. The first was whether we had enough to compel production of Cornerstone Federal's full customer records for the Pelham Road branch. The second was whether we had any reason to believe Sutton was acting alone. The answer to the first question was yes, based on the evidence in my mother's account alone. The answer to the second was that we didn't know yet, but Renata had a theory. The CF Trust code was systematic, too clean and consistent to be improvised. Someone had built it into the transaction routing infrastructure, which meant either Sutton had done it himself, with a level of technical knowledge that didn't fit his profile, or someone inside the bank's IT or compliance structure had helped him. Priscilla filed for the subpoena that afternoon. She also quietly contacted the office of the comptroller of the currencies examiner assigned to Cornerstone Federal and requested an informal conversation. The examiner's name was Douglas Hartwell, a 20-year veteran of bank examination who had the particular energy of a man who had spent 2 decades finding things that institutions did not want found. He called Renata directly the next morning, before the subpoena had even been served, and told her that his most recent examination of the Pelham Road branch had flagged an anomaly in the branch's internal transfer logs that he had flagged for follow-up, and that had subsequently been marked resolved in the system without documentation of how it was resolved. He had not been satisfied with that and had kept his own notes. He emailed those notes while they were still on the phone. The subpoena produced records for 340 customer accounts at the Pelham Road branch going back 4 years. Kwame and 2 analysts from the Financial Crimes Unit spent 72 hours going through them. What they found was methodical and devastating. 31 accounts showed transfers using the CF Trust reference code, all of them belonging to customers who were 60 years of age or older, all of them for amounts between $6,000 and $18,000, all structured below reporting thresholds, all routed to Cornerfield Asset Partners, LLC. Total amount stolen, $847,000 across 4 years. 31 elderly people who had done nothing wrong except trust their bank and not look closely enough at their statements, or look closely enough, as my mother had. And then been turned into suspects when they noticed. The oldest victim was 83. Several of them had been individually approached by Sutton about what he described as a private trust investment product that he claimed offered superior returns compared to standard savings rates. He had never put these conversations in writing. He had never provided documentation. He had charmed them in the way people who steal from the elderly always do, with warmth, with apparent patience, with the kind of careful attention that makes a person feel seen and important. I read the victim summaries and felt something in my chest that was past anger, a colder and more purposeful thing. Craig Sutton was arrested on a Wednesday morning at 7:15 a.m. at his home in a subdivision outside Greenville. Kwame led the arrest team. I was not present, both because of my conflict of interest and because I knew myself well enough to know that being there would cost me something I couldn't get back. Sutton was charged with wire fraud, bank fraud, elder financial exploitation under South Carolina state law, structuring transactions to evade reporting requirements, and money laundering. Each count carried significant federal sentencing exposure. His attorney, a man named Philip Cord, who specialized in white-collar defense, filed for bail and got it, $500,000 secured, meaning Sutton was out within 48 hours. That was hard to watch. The justice system moves at its own pace, and I know that, have always known it intellectually. But watching the man who stole $38,400 from my mother and nearly pinned it on her drive away from a courthouse in a car his wife brought to pick him up was a particular kind of hard to absorb. Renata called me that afternoon and said something she had probably said to 100 agents in her career. The arrest is the beginning. It's not the end. Stay in your lane. I told her I understood. I did understand. I stayed in my lane. It cost me more than I expected. What came out during the discovery phase of the prosecution was the part I had not fully anticipated, because even with 11 years in financial crimes, even knowing everything I knew about how these schemes work, I had assumed Sutton was the architecture. He was not. The IT anomaly that Douglas Hartwell had flagged turned out to be the thread that, when pulled, had revealed the full picture. The CF Trust routing infrastructure had been built into Cornerstone Federal's transaction system by a contractor named Rennick Systems LLC, which had handled the bank's software customization contract 3 years earlier. Rennick Systems was owned by a man named Gary Louth, who had worked at Cornerstone Federal for 6 years as a senior IT officer before leaving to start his contracting firm. Louth had built the backdoor routing architecture into the system at Sutton's direction and had received a flat fee of $120,000 wired to a personal account through a series of transactions that took the forensic accountants 2 weeks to fully reconstruct. Louth was arrested on a Thursday at his office in Columbia. He immediately began cooperating with the prosecution in exchange for a reduced charge recommendation, and his cooperation opened a third dimension to the case that nobody had predicted. Priscilla Nwankwo called me personally to give me the news, which she did not have to do, given that I was officially not on the case. I think she called me because she understood that some things you owe to the people who put a case in motion, even when those people are supposed to be at arm's length. She told me that Louth's cooperation had revealed that Craig Sutton was not the originator of the scheme. He had been recruited into it by Cornerstone Federal's Regional Vice President of Operations, a man named Desmond Alcott, who had been running elder financial exploitation schemes across multiple Cornerstone branches in South Carolina and Georgia for 6 years, using branch managers as ground-level operators and paying them commissions of 20% on whatever they stole. Alcott was 55, a 20-year bank veteran, well-regarded in industry circles, and a board member of 2 nonprofit organizations that provided financial literacy education to seniors. I sat with that particular piece of information for a long time. The man running a scheme to steal from elderly people was also a board member of organizations that claimed to protect them. I don't know why that detail hit differently than all the others, but it did. It was too perfectly grotesque to have invented. Desmond Alcott was arrested on a Friday morning at the regional office in Charlotte, where he had worked for 8 years. I know this because Renata texted me when it happened. 2 words. He's in. That was enough. The regional arrest triggered a bank-wide audit ordered by the OCC, the same federal agency I had worked for before joining the FBI, and Douglas Hartwell led it personally. The audit identified 11 Cornerstone Federal branches where the CF Trust routing architecture had been active, spanning 4 states, with total estimated customer losses of approximately $4.3 million across 112 victims, all of them elderly, all of them customers who had been identified as low sophistication users of the bank's digital systems, all of them chosen because they were unlikely to notice and unlikely to be believed if they did. The bank's board of directors placed Alcott on immediate suspension and announced a full internal review. 3 days later, under pressure from the OCC and the prospect of a consent order that would have restricted the bank's operations, Cornerstone Federal's CEO announced his own resignation. I heard about this on the news while I was sitting in my mother's kitchen drinking coffee. My mother watched the segment with her hands wrapped around her mug and said, without any particular drama, "Good." That one word, in her voice, was sufficient. The legal proceedings moved with the kind of speed that large-scale federal fraud cases sometimes develop when multiple defendants are cooperating against each other and the documentation is overwhelming. Louth pleaded guilty first to 1 count of computer fraud and 1 count of conspiracy to commit bank fraud in exchange for cooperation. His sentencing was deferred pending the completion of the broader prosecution. Craig Sutton's attorney attempted to negotiate a similar cooperation deal, but came to the table 6 weeks too late, after Louth had already provided everything the government needed. Sutton eventually pleaded guilty to 3 counts of wire fraud, 2 counts of bank fraud, and 1 count of elder financial exploitation under state law. His plea agreement carried a recommended federal sentence of 8 to 12 years. Desmond Alcott was the last to fall, and he fell hardest. His attorney argued for months that Alcott had not been personally involved in the mechanics of the scheme and had been unaware of the extent of what his branch managers were doing. This argument collapsed entirely when Priscilla introduced into evidence a series of encrypted messages recovered from Alcott's personal laptop, obtained through a search warrant, in which he personally directed Sutton to identify specific customer accounts, coached him on structuring amounts to avoid reporting thresholds, and once, in a message sent at 11:43 p.m. on a Saturday, instructed Sutton to flip the narrative if a customer raised questions, a phrase that made the jury pool during the eventual trial look at each other with an expression I recognized from 11 years of watching people absorb the full meaning of something ugly. Alcott was convicted on all counts after a 2-week trial. He was sentenced to 19 years in federal prison. He was 62 years old. The math was not in his favor. Cornerstone Federal Bank ultimately entered into a consent order with the OCC and a settlement agreement with the Department of Justice that required the bank to establish a $6.1 million restitution fund for all identified victims, implement comprehensive elder financial protection protocols across all branches, and submit to 2 years of enhanced federal examination oversight. Every victim received full restitution of the amounts stolen from their accounts, plus interest calculated from the date of the first unauthorized transfer. My mother received a check for $41,883, which represented her $38,400 in stolen funds plus 18 months of accrued interest. She deposited it the following Monday at a different bank, a credit union recommended by a financial counselor she had found through the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's Elder Care Resources, and she told me about it over the phone with the same even tone she used to tell me about her garden and her book club and what she was making for Sunday dinner. I had learned long ago that my mother's steadiness was not the absence of feeling. It was the discipline of a woman who had decided, somewhere along the way, that the world was not going to push her into pieces. I had always admired that. Standing on the other side of what the past 4 months had been, I understood it differently. She had called me crying from that bank because she was scared and alone and something was wrong. She had stopped crying the moment she knew help was coming. And then she had answered every question Kwame asked. It provided every document he needed and gotten out of the way and let the process work. She had trusted me, and I had trusted the people I worked with, and it had worked. Not quickly, not cleanly, but it had worked. Renata Obi called me 4 months after Alcott's sentencing to tell me I had been cleared of any conflict of interest findings by the Internal Review Board. The review had been initiated automatically when I disclosed the situation, and it had concluded that I had acted appropriately at every stage, had properly recused, had not accessed any case materials, and had not exerted any inappropriate influence on the investigation or prosecution. The finding was administrative and routine, and should not have meant anything particular to me. I read the letter twice. I am not going to pretend I didn't feel something. Why, I had spent those 4 months in a particular kind of limbo, knowing everything that was happening, being deliberately kept from it, trusting people I respected to do the work that I would have done if my mother weren't involved. It is a different thing. Trusting the system when you're inside it, and trusting it when someone you love is the one it's supposed to protect. I had not always been confident the outcomes would be the same. I was relieved that they were. But I was also aware of what my mother had said in that car outside the bank before I had called Renata, before Kwame had photographed the accordion folders, when I had told her that we were going to figure it out. She had looked at me with her steady librarian's eyes and said, I know. Oh, but what about the people who don't have a son who knows what to do? I had not had an answer then. I am not sure I had a full answer yet, but it lived in me. That question, it still does. I went back to work in the Charlotte field office on a Monday morning, 6 days after receiving the cleared finding. I had a new case file on my desk, a suspected mortgage fraud scheme in the Raleigh-Durham area involving 3 separate lending institutions and a network of property appraisers. Sophisticated, layered, the kind of thing that takes 18 months to build properly. I opened the file, read the executive summary, and started making notes. Somewhere in Greenville, South Carolina, my mother was at her Tuesday morning book club. Wait, she moved it to Wednesday. Her Wednesday morning book club. That's probably arguing about the ending of whatever novel they were reading. Probably right. And in a federal correctional institution somewhere in the Southeast, Desmond Alcott was beginning the first of 19 years in a place where no one would be bringing him complimentary coffee. I thought about the 112 people who had their money returned to them, and the question my mother had asked me in the car, and I picked up my pen. There was more work to do. There was always more work to do. But sometimes, when the system works the way it is supposed to work, it is enough to hold you through the next case. That morning, it was enough. If you made it this far, hit like. You've earned it.